Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Talking About International Topics. Today we're going to talk about some dangerous borders, specifically ones that I thought were worth discussing. We will not be including non-UN countries, such as Palestine or the Western Sahara.
Actually, I changed my mind at the end of editing, but forgot to change the script. There will be one that technically has a region that is not UN classified. Also, this isn't to say that I don't recognize the regions I just mentioned, it's just what I'm framing the video around.
And I will be avoiding all the obvious ones, such as North and South Korea, US and Mexico, Ukraine and Russia, and India and Pakistan, and the likes. Sorry, but if you want to learn about those, there are dozens of videos out there covering them. I also will not include any country more than once, so this should streamline the list pretty nicely. And this won't have any particular order either. Videos around dangerous borders are not an uncommon thing, but my findings have seen a very basic understanding, and they tend to lack a lot of historical context. So because of that, this will be the focus of the video. And with all these disclaimers out of the way, we can begin. We'll begin with the border between Bulgaria and Turkey. This 269-kilometer border found within the Balkans and Europe can date back to 1878. Both sides of it previously fell within the Ottoman Empire between the regions of Adrianople-Vilayet and Eastern Rumelia, until the Treaty of San Stefano. But nearly half a century later, just before the First World War, this was adjusted with the Treaty of Constantinople. After the war, the Treaty of Lausanne, which was between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire, saw the region occupied by Greece due to the Bulgarian-Ottoman Convention. So as you can see, this was off to a rough start, but outside of the Second World War, things stayed relatively quiet for a while. In the recent decades, a bit of a refugee influx of Middle Eastern, Asian, and North African migrants became a point of interest, similar to that between the US and Mexico. Bulgarian authorities have been found to be beating, robbing, and using attack dogs as means of pushback, with over 45,000 people reporting to have been victims of this. Moreover, the EU Frontex officers have been intimidated into silence, according to Balkan Insight. For your average tourist, crossing between these borders is certainly easier, but it should be warned to proceed with caution. One of the more obvious ones on this list would be the border between Iran and Iraq. This region of the world is a hotbed of border issues, thanks to the mishandling of borders drawn by the British Empire, which took no religious and ethnic origins into mind. However, this one has roots even further back. This border is a 1,600-kilometer line on the waterway that runs from the tri-point with Turkey all the way down to the Persian Gulf, known as the Shatt al-Arab, taking its origin in 1639. For one, no distinct line was drawn after the Ottoman Safavid War, but rather established a general understanding of the Tigris River and the Zagros Mountains separating the two empires. In the 18th century, the Ottomans along with the Russians invaded and seized part of modern-day Iran, until the Treaty of Carden in 1756 restored this border. This process would repeat more or less over and over. The early 20th century saw Russian and British colonial desires through the end of the Ottoman Empire expand, but the aforementioned issue around the Shatt al-Arab and the rise of Saddam Hussein in the 70s called us a more aggressive foreign policy from Iran. When Saddam took power in Iraq and the Islamic Revolution in Iran was bolstered, the former would invade, leading to the Iran-Iraq War, and while that's been over for years, there's still been an aftermath. Like many disputed regions, this is seen as a hot spot for terrorist groups, smugglers, and banditry. Moreover, Iranian forces are known for using lethal force towards those who cross this region, especially against ethnic Kurds. This is likely due to the smuggling of goods between the Kurdish majority regions, and it isn't uncommon to hear machine gun fire. Couriers of Iraqi Kurdish smugglers, as well as Iranian Revolutionary Guard, clash quite regularly. It doesn't help that these regions are greatly impoverished, and scorching high temperatures make it a tough trek as well. Moving away from this general region, we're going to take a look at a border between Colombia and Panama, in what is more commonly known as the Darien Gap. Now this one is a little less crafted around history and more about the nature of the terrain itself. The Darien Gap is a region surrounding the border on both sides, being largely part of why the Pan American Highway could not be built, as it would be far too difficult and costly to put roads here for the return to be worth it. It's inhospitable and remote, full of dense rainforests, mountains, and swamps. Being one of the wettest regions of the world, the constant rain creates landslides, and the extreme heat and humidity makes hunger and thirst even worse for those who try to traverse. Venomous pit vipers, crocodiles, and nearly threatened jaguar are also all over the place, none of which would be good for humans to encounter. This also includes deadly insects, Brazilian wandering spider, black scorpions, and ticks. With all of this, it isn't uncommon to succumb to disease and encounter unclean sources of water. The hike is said to take roughly 10 days, but if the environment isn't enough, the presence of Colombian paramilitary guerrillas known as FARC and other drug traffickers pose a threat of violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Skipping over to Africa, we're going to take a look at the border between Libya and Chad. Known as the Alzou Strip, this covers the entirety of the land between the two nations, with the border itself coming in around at 1,050 kilometers. While the Ottoman Empire controlled parts of coastal Libya, the start of this conflict only goes back to the scramble for Africa between European powers in 1884 at what is known as the Berlin Conference. By 1899, the border we see today would largely be formed, and in 1935, France's treaty with Italy shifted the boundary southwards, creating the Aouzou Strip. Libya gained independence roughly a decade before Chad saw the territory under French control, but everything changed with Muammar Gaddafi in 1969. Gaddafi would reclaim the strip as Libya's territory, likely due to the fact that large pockets of uranium were discovered underneath. He would also move forces into the region during the First Chadian Civil War, and things wouldn't truly settle until 1994 when the International Court of Justice saw it handed to Chad. However, that doesn't mean it's peaceful today. Many landmines still sit underneath this region of the border, which could go off given one step at the wrong place at the wrong time. Rebel groups are also found scattered throughout this region to this day, heavily due to contested gold mines. Since Gaddafi's overthrow, Libya as a whole and its southern border have seen larger influx of terrorism, instability, and factionalism between neighboring states. We'll return to the Middle East to take a look at Yemen, a country that I covered as one of my first videos, and northern neighbor Saudi Arabia. You may notice a pattern that a lot of these start with Ottoman or European clashes in occupied land. Yemen's border with Saudi Arabia wasn't clear until the end of the First World War, when the Arab Revolt pushed much of the Ottomans off the peninsula, and Ibn Saud later proclaimed Saudi Arabia as a nation. Yemen was divided in half all the way until the end of the Cold War with different spheres of influence, but the discovery of oil in the boundary region caused the need for negotiations after unification. A civil war broke out in 1994, and about 2 decades later the Houthi uprising would commence, which takes us to Saudi Arabia's war on the country. Saudi Arabia would insist that Iran backed the latest uprising, and supported by the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and others, it would begin airstrikes and blockades on Yemen, killing many civilians and bringing hunger and strife to the already unstable situation. Today, mass killings by Saudi border guards against Ethiopian asylum seekers are also being reported, including women and children. Explosive weapons and close-range firing have been carried out, even as some retreat back towards Yemen. It's also been reported that Houthis have worked with smugglers to kidnap those who cross and hold and abuse them until they can pay an exit fee. Moving northward, we'll return to Eurasia, with Armenia and Azerbaijan, the lesser-known conflict between 2 former Soviet republics. This region was a hotbed of contested borders in the late 19th century, as these territories were a meeting point of Ottoman, Persian, and Russian interests. By 1867, both nations were heavily organized into Russian governorates, and relations with those governorates were often tense and violent. The Russian Revolution of 1917 didn't help much, as different Caucasus republics were declared and dispersed several times within a short window. When the Red Army seized control of both, the Soviet Kov Bureau would draw the lines we see today, and while protests popped up within Armenia over the decades, things didn't pick up heavily until after Soviet dissolution, with the Nagorno-Karabakh region trying to declare independence. Azerbaijan would spark a 3-year war in the early 90s, ending in a ceasefire, but still creating international frontier. This remained in place until 2020, and shelling and attack drones have been used along the border between the 2 nations. Several thousand soldiers and civilians have been killed by this conflict, seeing much of the land from the First World War by Armenia back in Azerbaijan. Continuous back-and-forth breachings of the ceasefire have been launched since, and despite Russia's aims to maintain stability within the Lachin corridor, this border remains just as unpredictable. Moving eastward, we're going to take a look at the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. This entire border is known as the Durand Line, spanning 4,250 kilometers from the Hindu Kush to the Pamir Mountains. This was established in 1893 between British India and Afghanistan, named after Sir Henry Mortimer Durand. It passes through the Karakoram Range, the Rajasthan Desert, and the White Mountains, making it vary greatly in elevation, but that's not the reason for the danger. In 1947, when newly created Pakistan inherited this agreement, a Pashtun independence movement was pushed near the border, and Afghanistan also refused to accept the British-drawn line, now seeing it as void. These Pashtun tribes would be recruited to the Mujahideen forces as the Soviet-Afghan War commenced, and Pakistan became a weapon for the Western forces in the Cold War. The result would see the Afghan Civil War and the rise of the Taliban. Regardless, the Afghan government has never since recognized this line, and they continue to seek the return of Pashtun territories for access to the Arabian Sea. The construction of a fence at the borders led to even more hostilities between the 2 nations, and continuous airstrikes and attacks go on regardless of who is in power. Jumping up north, we're going to look at a very specific part of the border between Russia and Mongolia, specifically at a region known as Tuva. Russian expansion into Siberia in the 17th century would bring them into conflict with the Qing dynasty, which had modern-day Mongolia under its control. Skipping to 1727, the Treaty of Kyakhta saw much of the border we still see today. This still left Tuva on the Chinese side. Why is this significant? Tuva would break away from China, now Mongolia, during the Xinhai Revolution, which established the Republic of China in 1911. By 1944, it would be annexed by the Soviet Union, known as the Tuvan Autonomous Oblast. After the Union's dissolution, an attack on the Russian minority was carried out, causing military intervention and a mass exodus of ethnic Russians. If you haven't noticed a pattern, these issues tend to open up paths for smugglers. However, because of the nature of this region, theft along here has included livestock. Lack of stable infrastructure deep in the Siberian forest makes it very remote and desolate, with brutal winters, and there is a high homicide rate thanks to poverty that this region's history has led it to. Going all the way to the Caribbean, we'll now take a look at Hispaniola, the island that both Haiti and Dominican Republic fall on. Now this one is very obviously due to European colonization, dating back to the 16th and 17th centuries when the French and Spanish divided their new territories. After years of conflict over this, the line we see today goes back to 1777 due to the Treaty of Aranjuez. While the Spanish side was more of a settler colony, the French side saw loads of slavery and forced relocation of Africans, which would dominate the demographic and lead to the Haitian Revolution. When the Dominican Republic declared independence, Haiti shortly after invaded in hopes of securing the entire island, leading to a war in 1844 before the current border returned. Disputes would continue all the way up into the early 20th century, and even after the final border treaty, Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo carried out immense levels of anti-Haitian violence, including the Parsley Massacre. Today the border between the two countries remains closed, but there are still roads connecting the two. Rampant poverty has seen many Haitians cross to the Dominican side, and you can find barbed wire fences running along certain parts of the border. Moreover, harassment of migrants through physical and sexual assault aren't uncommon, and xenophobia has caused some less than friendly treatment of folks with darker skin coming from the border. In fact, anti-black racism is such an issue in the country that African Americans are advised to take extra caution when traveling to the Dominican Republic. The last and perhaps most unique one we'll take a look at is Cyprus, as it's the only one on this list that is within the country itself. Cyprus has a UN buffer zone that separates the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus and the Republic of Cyprus. This only dates back to 1964, with extensions following several battles and ceasefires, including the Battle of Tiliuria. This was the result of a Greek Cypriot coup that was short-lived before the Turkish invasion. Since then, barbed wire fences and concrete borders have been erected, and there are many watchtowers and several minefields in the buffer zone, much like the DMZ in Korea. UN peacekeepers are said to have been attacked, and both sides of the buffer zone have been accused of infringing on the buffer zone. Yet, there are still active villages that fall within this zone, and some of the abandoned infrastructure in other areas is unsafe to traverse. Thank you for taking the time to look at some dangerous borders with me. What did you think? Did I forget to include any that you think should have been included? Have you been to any of these borders? Please let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time.